Hi everyone, welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan LaPier. This week, to mark episode 25 of the podcast, we're switching things up a bit. As much as the immigration news moves quickly these days, there are also key issues that continue to be relevant. So today we'll take a look back at a few of our discussions from past episodes and bring them up to date. But first, remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're at it, leave a review to help more people find this program. You can also stream This Week in Immigration on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org. And as always, check out bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration for more information on the stories we discuss here on the show. And here with me today are Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. Hi, Theresa.
Hi, Jordan.
And Cris Ramón, Policy Analyst.
Hey,
Cris.
Jordan. How's it going?
Good. So, we're doing things a little bit differently. We're going to play a few clips. Let's start here. Over the last year, we've been exploring the ways non-citizens use public benefits and pay into those systems. So let's start with our discussion from episode 15. Former BPCer Hunter Hallman wrote a blog post exploring whether and how undocumented immigrants pay taxes, and as it turns out, many of them do. So here she is back in April explaining why.
So in large part, it comes down to a chance at future legalization. Many legislative attempts at immigration reform have included language about paying back taxes or good moral character, and that includes the famous Gang of Eight comprehensive immigration reform bill that was passed by the Senate in 2013. A documentation of paying your taxes for all your years working in the U.S. is a relatively easy way to show a good faith effort at being of good moral character, quote unquote.
So, but to be clear, is this about getting access to benefits? What federal benefits would these undocumented workers be eligible for?
So actually, undocumented immigrants are eligible for very few federal benefits. So SNAP, Medicaid, Social Security, they are not eligible for any of those. The one exception is the child tax credit, and that's designed to support low-income families with dependent children. However, last year's tax laws passed by Congress changed that rule a little bit, so now only filers whose dependents have Social Security numbers can claim the credit, which didn't used to be the case.
All right, so let's bring this up to date. Theresa, what's been our biggest takeaway in researching non-citizen eligibility for and use of public benefits?
So what Hunter said in that is still true. Undocumented immigrants are really ineligible for any sort of federal benefits. Over the last several years, various states have either passed laws that would make undocumented immigrants eligible for some state benefits, most notably in California, and others to prevent that. Other states have done that. But the issue of public use of benefits has gained traction, immigrant use of benefits has gained traction because the administration has, we believe, a proposed rule that they are getting ready that would change the definition of something called public charge. And we talked about this a little bit on the podcast before. Public charge is a provision of immigration law that says that an immigrant can be denied entry or denied immigration if they are likely to become a public charge. That term hasn't really been defined very clearly, but it's been generally assumed to mean somebody who's going to be completely reliant on the government, not somebody who has to occasionally use a benefit. And legal immigrants are eligible for some benefits, particularly immigrants after they've been here 5 years. So even the threat of this public charge regulation is causing some immigrants to forego benefits they may be legally eligible for fear that it will hurt them at time if they want to become naturalized or hurt other family members or their ability to sponsor other family members. So this debate is going to continue. It's going to go on for a while.
And this issue also came up in our nationwide survey on voter sentiment on immigrants and immigration earlier this year. Tell me what Americans said about their perceptions of how non-citizens are using those public benefits.
So there's a widespread perception in the United States that immigrants are using a lot of public benefits, including undocumented immigrants, which, as I've said, is not really true. But that perception persists. And when we surveyed people about what concerns them most about our current immigration system, number one issue was that somehow immigrants were obtaining benefits that should go to Americans first. That was their largest concern with our current immigration system, and that was way above concerns about whether or not immigrants were taking jobs from Americans or lowering wages. As a matter of fact, those two issues came near the bottom of the list of potential concerns. So again, for the public, there's a widespread belief that immigrants are using these benefits. There's a concern that these benefits are somehow lessened for Americans if they're using them. Concern that there is a that immigrants are taking benefits away from Americans by using them. And so in that context, that's one of the reasons probably why the administration is looking to do this public charge rule.
Yeah, and then it's interesting because if you actually take a step back and look at the research, what the research shows is that the usage rates of individual immigrants is actually lower than native-born Americans, but where it gets a little bit dicier is when you're talking about households headed by immigrants. And the research there tends to show that, immigrant-headed households tend to use benefits a little bit higher than those of native-born Americans. So it's the research is there. The question is, does the public care about that?
Yeah, and the difference there is, though, that immigrant-headed households very often have U.S. citizen children. The citizen children are eligible for more benefits, and that's how they qualify. So one of the public policy debates is, should they cut benefits to immigrants that would harm their U.S. citizen children? And that's, I think, going to be, again, one of the big debatable issues as this public charge regulation moves forward.
All right, after the break, extreme vetting. We've spent a great deal of time on this podcast exploring the Trump administration's efforts to step up screening for visitors to the United States and make it harder for foreigners to work here. Here's a bit of our conversation from episode 16 back in May with National Security Policy Analyst Jessica Michek on the Trump administration's plan to stand up a new agency, the National Vetting Center, to conduct what they call extreme vetting.
A major government agency is the National Targeting Center, which was set up in 2001 after the September 11th attacks. Mm-hmm. And it exists to screen travelers and share information among federal databases. This center, it begins screening travelers as soon as they book their flights to the United States. Officials have stated that this new center will work closely with the National Targeting Center as well as other federal agencies, such as the Terrorist Screening Center and the National Counterterrorism Center. But one way that the National Vetting Center seems to be slightly set apart from some of these agencies is that its role isn't just to screen travelers. It will also have an increased role in screening individuals already present in the United States who might be applying for citizenship or residency.
Theresa, can you update us on what's been happening with the administration's efforts to tighten security screenings for foreign visitors? It seems that maybe this issue has disappeared a little bit from the public consciousness since the Supreme Court's ruling in favor of the Trump administration's travel ban back in June.
Sure. So one thing to say is that the National Vetting Center has been stood up. It has been active, and it is behind the scenes exploring a wider variety of immigration policies and benefits. We don't yet know the impact of that. Again, that's happening sort of behind the scenes and on the law enforcement side. But what we do know, going back, for example, to the travel ban, although the Supreme Court allowed it to go into place, there's still litigation around it. In particular, a group of people have sued that the provisions of the executive order do allow for waivers from the ban in certain cases, but that the government is not issuing those waivers. And so the litigation now is whether or not those are really waivers available or whether it's just sort of language that makes it seem like it's available. So we're not done with that yet. As far as the screening and vetting, there's a couple of other things that we do know. We have seen a decline in the rate of refugees coming to the United States, even from countries without the travel ban. And one of the things that is being attributed to is the stepping up of the vetting process. And so fewer refugees are being settled even below the 45,000 cap that the administration had for this year. And a lot of people believe that it is due to the screening and vetting. The other thing we have seen is a decline in visas from many parts of the world where we could imagine that extreme vetting would be taking place. And whether or not that's a decline in applications or a decline in the number of people coming into the United States after applying is hard to tell. There are lots of anecdotes about individuals seeing hardships in getting their family members over here. So certainly things are taking place on the vetting side.
Cris, relatedly, you've been tracking regulations that could make it harder for foreigners to work in the United States. So what's the latest on that front?
Right. So back in January, I was talking about a whole host of different regulations under what the administration called Buy American, Hire American. It's an executive order they issued last year. And part of that really was promoting different policies, largely regulations, that made it harder for workers who wanted to obtain H-1B high-skilled visas to come to the United States and work. And, I basically covered a whole host of policies. Now, where are they now? A lot of them are still in the proposed stage or being debated, largely because this, as reports have indicated this public charge rule that we talked about is kind of taking up a lot of the bandwidth and the focus of the administration on kind of getting that through. So nothing really major has come through. But what we do know is that, this H-4 dependent spouses visa, which is basically it's a visa category for the spouses of H-1B non-immigrants who basically are able to receive employment authorization to work in the United States. The Trump administration has been targeting this for some time, and at least what reports and discussions are indicating that will be largely rescinded, but once this public charge rule comes through. But in terms of really what's been in effect, well, there are some policies. One in particular is that USCIS issued a policy that required employers to provide contracts and itineraries for employers that will work at third-party locations. So these individuals get H-1Bs to work for their employers, but the issue is always whether or not they're going to third-party sites. The idea behind this is sort of to basically cut down and fight basically employers that try to they're called H-1B farms. They're basically getting these H-1Bs to send them to a third-party contract, and they're sort of taking up a lot of the H-1B visas to be able to do this. And so this new policy is in effect is combating that. But like I said, there's a lot of discussions, a lot of proposed rules. I think the bottleneck is the public charge rule, but we can definitely expect a lot more coming down the pike once that clears out.
So we also looked recently at how the government can revoke citizenship in unique cases. Here's a short clip from our former intern Tim O'Shea explaining what this process called denaturalization entails and some of the new ways the Trump administration is pursuing these cases.
For the past 30 years, denaturalization was quite rare. For instance, people could be denaturalized if they served in the military of a country fighting the United States. These newer cases revolve mainly around immigration applications themselves. The forms that you fill out when applying for a change of immigration status contain many questions about a person's background, especially their criminal history and immigration history with the United States. If someone lies about past convictions, crimes, deportations, or anything like that, then they could have that immigration status, including citizenship, taken away if the government discovers they were lying.
Okay, so Cris, as you heard Tim say there, the Trump administration was stepping up efforts to denaturalize some citizens earlier this summer. Do you see that trend continuing?
The trend is continuing, but I think what's been reported more recently is at least a spate of denials of benefits such as passports for individuals who were born along the Texas-Mexico border. Washington Post reported on this a couple weeks ago, and the idea is that individuals who thought they were U.S. citizens, who thought they had birth certificates, were trying to apply for something like renewal of visas or trying to return to the United States, and the Trump administration, U.S. officials were basically saying, no, we need more information, or we're going to deny your renewal application for a passport, for instance, because you don't have legitimate documents. So this is sort of, is this directly related to denaturalization? No, but it shows another way of sort of the Trump administration making it harder, or at least trying to fight what they call fraud in the system. And that's the whole point. It is worth noting that an update to the story, initially, a lot of folks were talking about it, that the State Department did actually provide data to the Washington Post saying that these sort of rejections were actually at a 4-year low. But the question is there. What is the administration doing to sort of fight this kind of fraud?
Yeah, and I would say that these Texas cases do revolve around people who were born in South Texas, not in a hospital, but to midwives. And so in the second half of the 21st century, like 1950 to 1980, 1990, that was very common because it was very difficult to get to the hospitals. They were far away. So midwives delivered a lot of babies at home. And then the midwife was responsible for reporting that to the vital information services of Texas to get a birth certificate. Well, a certain number of these midwives admitted after investigation that they had filed these Texas birth certificate requests on behalf of babies who were actually born in Mexico, thus getting them a U.S. birth certificate. So some number of fraudulent birth certificates. And the problem is, because it's all based on the word of these midwives, the government cannot tell which were fraudulent and which were real. And so there's been a suspicion of this group of folks for under two administrations, from the Bush administration, Obama administration, and now. So this has been ongoing for a while. It's hit the papers again because of some recent cases in South Texas of individuals who were denied passports or had their passports questioned upon entry. And again, given the overall context of the Trump administration and with regard to the denaturalization, there was a presumption that this is somehow an extension of the administration's sort of going after potential Latino citizens. The real issue is a little bit more complicated than that. And again, as Tim said, these denaturalization cases that are about people who lied on their naturalization applications, that was started under Obama and Bush as well. So it seems like this administration is sort of continuing and maybe expanding some efforts that began under previous administrations to try to get at fraudulent cases. And that expansion, combined with sort of the overall tenor of how this administration talks about immigration, is causing a lot of concern.
Yeah, I mean, you can also say the same thing, for instance, with the family separations policy. That family separations, talking about prosecuting of parents for entering into the country illegally with their children, those prosecutions, like we've said before, happened underneath the Bush and Obama administrations through Operation Streamline. We've talked about that a lot of time in this podcast. The difference, of course, is the political context has changed, and as a result, something that is, you've seen continuity across three administrations now, is now being seen differently. And I think really, if you had to take a whole step back and look at this whole discussion about screening and vetting, basically, making it harder for individuals to work here, or this whole denaturalization push, so much of it is informed by perceptions of what the administration has been saying about immigration and how it intends to crack down and the policies that they're doing that. And disentangling the policy from the politics is really the key thing. Administrations have done this in the past, but that's really, it's a question of political context more than anything else.
All right. Up ahead, the fight in Congress. Let's turn now to Congress. The early part of this year was dominated by congressional intrigue and votes on DACA replacements, but we also spent some time talking about funding, specifically whether Congress would appropriate funds for a border wall or perhaps other security and enforcement measures. Theresa, you explained how the last battle shook out back in March during episode 13. Let's listen.
The administration did get $1.6 billion for border security, and that includes some money for something called a border wall system, but very clearly non-concrete barriers.
So not a wall.
Not a wall. Not
Fences,
a wall.
maybe.
Fences and bollard systems, similar to what's already on places on the border. And much of that money is going to go to actually replacing or repairing existing fencing. In less than 100 miles of new areas will have infrastructure. Some of that money is also going toward other technologies like videos and sensors and other technologies that's used along the border. There's money to continue to try to hire Border Patrol officers to their current level, but the president did not get his additional officers that he wants either.
So obviously there was no grand bargain for a DACA replacement in exchange for stepped-up border enforcement in the end, but appropriations and funding issues are bubbling up again as the end of the government's fiscal year approaches, and President Trump has made some threats about vetoing a budget or a continuing resolution that doesn't contain funding for a border wall. So Theresa, is that likely to be the key flashpoint? And what are the other funding fights that we might see in the tail end of this year?
Yes, so the president is continuing to make border wall funding a key issue. He has said many times via Twitter and in other places that he is willing to consider a shutdown of the government if he doesn't get what he's asking for right now, $5 billion for his border wall. I think Republican leadership in Congress is hopeful they can postpone that fight till after the elections. They don't necessarily see that shutting down the government would be helpful to them. It's not sure whether clear whether the president agrees with that or not. But they do have to find a way to either fund the government or pass what's called a continuing resolution to continue the existing funding for the government after October 1. So September is key appropriations time. That discussion will be happening. There are a few other issues, though, that are at play. One, especially with regard to what happened with the family separation since the last appropriation fight, is whether or not there will be riders on any of the appropriations bills, whether it be the DHS appropriations bill bill, or Health and Human Services, who again takes care of the immigrant children, to either limit the ability of the administration to separate families, or to, as the president might want to say, to allow them to detain families together. That could be another front in this war. And then there's the overall issue of detention writ large. This administration has been detaining more immigrants. They have actually reprogrammed money from other parts of the last year's budget to fund additional detention facilities for adults and for families. Congress has to agree to that. They don't have to actually pass anything, but the appropriators have to okay it. But in this year's funding, there's a lot of Democrats already who are saying they want to zero out that funding. There's also the overall funding for ICE. And so there's controversy over whether or not and how much money ICE should get for its overall operations. So the next set of immigration battles, if you will probably be over the appropriations legislation in the next month and a half.
And there's a prospect that Democrats will take control of the House, possibly, maybe the Senate after the midterms. How do you see that shaping the next round of conflicts over funding, and what are some of the new battle lines that might be drawn in the new year?
So, assuming that they don't pass final legislation before October 1st and they do pass a continuing resolution until after the election, then we have a situation of a lame duck Congress. And depending on who wins control of the House and the Senate, that will sort of define how the parties are going to want to negotiate. For example, if the Democrats take back the House, will Republicans prefer to try to negotiate with the Democrats in a lame duck where they still have a majority of the votes to get a bill that's more to their liking and maybe the president's liking, rather than support a continuing resolution into the early part of next year where Democrats will control the House and have more leverage? Well, Democrats want to do that where they want to push it off to the next year when they have more leverage. So there's a lot of strategizing going on probably right now up in the halls of Congress about what they want to do and how they will do this. But in point of fact, pretty much no member of Congress really wants to shut down the government. It never tends to work well for whichever party initiates the shutdown. Republicans were blamed for it under the Obama administration. The Democrats got blamed for it the last time under the Trump administration. So it just doesn't bode well for whoever initiates it, and most members of Congress would like to avoid that. The president, however, seems keen on trying to force his border wall funding and probably some of his other priorities. So whether or not he's going to initiate that or not remains to be seen. In any case, the other thing to think about is if Democrats take back the House, or if Republicans continue, what the opportunities are for non-appropriations related immigration legislation next year. And I think there's still a lot of pent-up demand for Democrats and for Republicans to try to deal with permanently with the DACA situation. So that may definitely prompt some sort of look at legislation early next year.
One of the things that we've been talking about as well is, and we'll talk about this in the next segment about DACA litigation, but at least as of this time, there hasn't been a split circuit decision on the DACA cases, and so as a result, sort of we were saying, if there was a split decision, a set of injunctions saying the program has to restart, and another one saying it can't, coming out of South Texas, that Congress would need to act right away. Obviously, there will be appeals for the decision, and there's a lot happening on the litigation front. But in terms of looking at Congress, right now there's no propelling force for them to address this issue now. The other thing to consider as well is the lame duck session, though. If Democrats take the House, what will happen during the lame duck session with Republicans as well?
All right. In a moment, immigration in the courts. Stick around. Finally today, we've seen much of the immigration drama this year playing out in the courts. So let's focus in on two hot topics in the courtroom, DACA and sanctuary cities. Cris, here's a bit of tape from you back in April talking about the legal fights over sanctuary laws in California and the interplay between local, state, and federal law enforcement when it comes to immigration.
So this is where it gets really interesting. I wrote an info brief a while back talking about how with sanctuary policies, you have three different levels of governance or governments that participate in these issues. You have state governments like California that can pass a pro-sanctuary city law, but then you can see counties and cities actually having their own policies on these issues. So in reality, what you're seeing is this is actually now starting to come into the fore with this debate in California, because what you're seeing a lot of cities, particularly in Orange County, either voting to exempt themselves from SB 54, or they're actually voting to, basically support the Trump administration's lawsuit against California.
So let's bring this discussion up to speed. Theresa, the Justice Department obviously does not favor sanctuary policies and has taken some steps to try to stop them. What's the latest on that legal fight?
Sure. So that California decision, the district judge ruled in favor of California and against the Department of Justice over their opposition to sanctuary city legislation. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals is at least issued a partial injunction saying Department of Justice can't require cooperation with ICE as a condition for various Justice Department grants to California cities. A similar ruling came out of a district judge in Philadelphia that applied to Philadelphia. And probably the broadest ruling was in Chicago. The city of Chicago sued over the same criteria. And the district judge there actually ruled preliminarily that the underlying statute, something called 8 U.S.C. 1373, that the government relied on to push these requirements may be unconstitutional. Now that case is has been up to the Seventh Circuit of Appeal. They did not issue a nationwide injunction, but the lower court still might. But so far, DOJ has not really come out on top on any of the sanctuary city litigation. And so at least as far as we have right now, it looks like they're losing on that in the courts where they have been challenged on that. However, despite that, they don't have yet a nationwide injunction preventing them from doing this. So in the current round of grant requirements, cities that are applying for these Justice Department grants still have to make these certifications that they are allowing ICE into their jails, that they are sharing information about when they are releasing immigrants, and that they are not preventing people from honoring ICE detainers. So Department of Justice still is pushing forward with this, even though so far they have not been prevailing in the courts.
All right, so then moving over to DACA, and here we're actually treading a little bit of new ground. So since we last talked, there was a court hearing in Texas on the DACA program's legality. Walk me through what happened in that hearing and what we know so far.
Sure. So Judge Hannon, the same judge that ordered an end to President Obama's expanded DACA program in 2014, was ruling on a new case filed by Texas and other states against DACA. In a somewhat surprise move to many court watchers, the judge did not issue an injunction in this case. He did not issue a preliminary injunction opposing the DACA program. He said basically that the states waited too long to file their case against DACA, and that it was hard for him to say that there was some kind of an emergency that required an immediate injunction against the program. That having been said, he did kind of indicate, though, that he thought maybe the states of Texas and the other states might win in his court on the merits that the underlying program was not created lawfully. But he doesn't intend to do anything until he rules finally on that sometime later this year. So a lot of people were expecting him to issue an injunction, as Cris said earlier in the program, that would have said, nope, we need to end this program right now. Of course, we have other injunctions in place in Maryland and California that said, no, the administration needs to keep the program going. We have a DC district judge who said, not only do you need to allow people to reapply, but you may even need to open it to everybody. That injunction is still pending appeal. If the judge in Texas had issued a contrary nationwide injunction, that pretty much would have set the stage for the Supreme Court to weigh in as soon as possible. Since the Texas judge didn't do that, DACA remains kind of at status quo. And as we talked about, that means that we probably won't have some sort of litigation action forcing event for a number of months on DACA. Most people do expect this will eventually get to the Supreme Court. One of the fears that came up earlier is that it might get to the Supreme Court before there was a ninth judge confirmed. That could have resulted in a deadlock and frankly just chaos as you have competing injunctions. Now that's less of a risk because it's more likely there'll be a ninth judge confirmed by the time these underlying cases get to the Supreme Court.
I want to ask a broader question, though, which is there danger in having so much of America's immigration policy being hashed out in court right now?
I think definitely there is. And again, Cris alluded to this in the clip that you had about what's going on in California and the cities. The result of this litigation is we are pitting lots of levels of government against each other. There's a big fight over whether courts in one part of the country really can legally continue to issue injunctions that prevent the government from implementing its policies across the country. There's a lot of people that want to see that issue litigated. They think that that's overreaching authority. And again, it kind of depends on what side of the litigation you're on. Liberal members of the judiciary did not like when nationwide injunctions were issued under the Obama administration against Obamacare and against DAPA, and now it's the conservatives and the Republicans who don't like the judges issuing nationwide injunctions against Trump's policies. So, it's sort of in the eye of the beholder whether it's good or bad at any given time. But this continuing use of injunctions may yet get to the Supreme Court. Under the travel ban case, one of the dissenting opinions, or a concurring opinion rather, indicated that the judges were interested in looking at this issue specifically. So at some point we will get a case at the Supreme Court that says whether or not judges can issue nationwide injunctions. So at some point the court system itself may take care of whether or not litigation is a way to actually inform nationwide policy. But the other short-term thinking about it is that the ultimate solutions to all of this is for Congress to act. And one of the reasons it's going to court is because Congress has been unable to do anything on immigration.
Yeah, and it's not particularly healthy for the country either. I think that we are in such a polarized environment where both sides of the issue want complete, total, absolute victory over the other side. And of course, the courts are perfect for that. The problem is that by relying on litigation, you might actually get outcomes you don't want. Advocates were absolutely furious about the decision about the travel ban the Supreme Court had issued. But that's really one of the risks you have with litigation. And so the thing is that when you sort of think to yourself, well, I'm just going to, bank it all on the courts and not try to go through the legislative process, which of course requires compromise, which requires a consensus, which requires conceding at points to somebody who has an opposite view. When you concede all that and you don't have that whole process where you can come together on consensus and produce effective policies, you're going to run the risk of having these zero-sum outcomes. And as a result, the question really is this really good for the country as a whole? And ultimately, I think it's not.
Okay, well, I want to thank you both for the update and for 25 great episodes. And thanks to you all for listening, and a special thanks as always to our producer Emily Schrader. Please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your feedback on this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.